Now I want to continue our Bible study with part 2 of the Israeli-Hamas war, a biblical perspective. Particularly, I want to look at chapter 24 of Matthew's Gospel and how it may relate to the Israeli-Hamas war. The war is a result of the launching of a vicious attack on Israel from the Gaza Strip by Hamas 2.5 weeks ago. A few days ago, the Israeli army began the ground attack into northern Gaza. Every time events heat up with Israel, speculation arises as to whether this is the beginning of the end of the age, as Jesus called it, when he will return to earth. This speculation is caused by the prophecies in the Old and New Testaments about the return of Jesus, the Messiah, to judge the world and establish the new heaven and the new earth, as described in the book of Revelation. On our gospel reading schedule, next week's gospel reading is from Matthew chapter 25. Chapter 24 is skipped because it contained the gospel reading on the first Sunday of Advent, last November 27th. It opened the Advent season with a gospel reading from chapter 24, verses 37 to 44. The first verses of the reading summarize the highlight of chapter 24. Jesus said to his disciples, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. In those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day that Noah entered the ark. They did not know until the flood came and carried them all away. So will it be also at the coming of the Son of Man." This passage comes after the gospel readings we have studied for the last several weeks from Matthew, chapters 21, 22, and 23. Jesus rides triumphantly into Jerusalem, then teaches in the temple to the large crowd who was there for the Passover feast, the last Passover that Jesus will celebrate before he goes to the cross. Chapter 24 continues with Jesus talking about his return to earth after his ascension. He has left the temple area and is sitting with his disciples on the Mount of Olives just east of Jerusalem. It's still the Tuesday after Jesus made his triumphant entry into Jerusalem the previous Sunday. How could chapter 24 of Matthew's Gospel be the reading for the beginning of Advent, which is the season leading up to the birth of Jesus, is coming into the world the first time? While he is specifically talking about his second coming here, it's also his first coming and was appropriate for the beginning of Advent. As we have studied the Gospels this year, the environment was identical to what Jesus describes when he tells his disciples in chapter 24 here about his second coming. Not only were people doing the same things they normally do and were caught unprepared for Jesus the first time, in addition to that, we see the religious leaders contending with Jesus, doubting who he was, and arguing with him. After all, they were expecting a Messiah who would ride into town, overthrow the Romans, clean out the corrupt government, and set himself up as the king of God's kingdom here on the earth. So chapter 24 fits for the people who were unprepared for his first coming, just as he is saying they will be unprepared for his second. The religious leaders, the theologians of his day, totally misinterpreted the Old Testament prophecies of Jesus' first coming. Therefore, I think it behooves us to look at the prophecies of his second coming, but keep in mind that our modern theologians who attempt to interpret the Old and New Testaments that prophesy the second coming of Jesus may be wrong in whole or in part. In order to understand how the interpretation of the prophecies lead us to believe current events in Israel may be the prelude to the second coming of Jesus, I want to look at passages from the book of Revelation. They parallel the teaching that Jesus provides to us in the Gospels, as well as other Old and New Testament passages that are interpreted as prophecy to Jesus returning. The first 13 chapters of the book of Revelation include the visions John had leading up to the triumphant return of Jesus and judgment of humanity. Chapter 14 of Revelation begins the description of what will happen leading up to the final battle that will precipitate Jesus' return. To identify the verses of the book of Revelation, I will be showing them in orange text. Revelation 14:1 says, "Then I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion." This is Jesus' spiritual presence on Mount Zion, not his physical presence yet, which is the Temple Mount on which the first and second Jewish temples stood. He will physically arrive in later chapters. The Lamb is Jesus, as John calls him in his gospel. Now back to Matthew's gospel, chapter 24, Jesus is with the disciples on Tuesday before his final Passover and describes to his disciples what will be happening when he prepares to return physically to earth. Starting at verse 6, he says, "You will hear of wars and reports of wars. See that you're not alarmed, for these things must happen, but it will not yet be the end. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes from place to place. All these are the beginning of the labor pains. Then they will hand you over to persecution, and they will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name." Well, we've seen wars and reports of wars over the last 2,000 years, but here he says nation will rise against nation, describing the final battle before he returns. There have always been famines and earthquakes, but those that occur just before his return will be worse than ever before. It, in fact, is perhaps being fulfilled now as climate change has created extremes that are worse than have ever been recorded. In any case, Jesus continues. Oh, here's nation will rise against nations. I need to freeze frame that. Then, and famines and earthquakes. Then Jesus continues. "And then many will be led into sin. They will betray and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and deceive many. And because of the increase of evil doing, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who perseveres to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the world as a witness to all nations. And then the end will come." As Jesus says here in verse 14, before he returns, the gospel will be preached throughout the world. This is described in Revelation chapter 14, verses 6 and 7. This is John once again describing his vision. "Then I saw another angel flying high overhead with the everlasting gospel to announce to those who dwell on earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people. He said in a loud voice, 'Fear God and give him glory, for his time has come to sit in judgment. Worship him who made heaven and earth and sea and springs of water.'" Then John gives us another vision he has of Jesus before he comes physically to the earth in Revelation 14:14. "Then I looked, and there was a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud, one who looked like a son of man, with a gold crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, crying out in a loud voice to the one sitting on the cloud, 'Use your sickle and reap the harvest, for the time to reap has come, because the earth's harvest is fully ripe.' So the one who was sitting on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested." This is Jesus harvesting those who believe in him. This is followed by the passages telling us the final battle on the earth will be in Israel, as it is interpreted from verses 18 through 20. Then another angel came from the altar, who was in charge of the fire, and cried out in a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, "Use your sharp sickle and cut the clusters from the earth's vines, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and cut the earth's vintage. He threw it into the great winepress of God's fury. The winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood poured out of the winepress to the height of a horse's bridle for 200 miles. Vines in Scripture are representations of Israel. Jesus says in his final discourse in John's Gospel that he is the true vine. In other words, he is the true Israel. The grapes from the vine are cast into the winepress, representative of the people of Israel being in a battle and being trodden with blood pouring out of the winepress, the height of the horse's bridle, for 200 miles. 200 miles is a little less than the length of Israel from north to south. And here in the book of Revelation, from the end of chapter 14 to chapter 16, John has shown visions of armies and weapons being amassed for this final battle. While Israel is being prepared as the location for the final battle, Revelation chapters 15 through 16 show the kinds of things that will happen on the earth as God prepares to send his Son to judge the world. I heard a loud voice speaking from the temple to the 7 angels, "Go and pour out the 7 bowls of God's fury upon the earth." So in summary, these are the calamities that result from the 7 bowls being poured out. The first one being disease or pandemics. The second one being massive fish dying in the sea. The third, rivers being contaminated. The fourth, people are scorched by heat waves. The fifth, immorality causes spiritual darkness. The sixth, the Euphrates River will dry up. The seventh, that judgment is against those who reject God. So we see many of these things happening today: pandemic and contamination of rivers and heat waves, immorality causing spiritual darkness. So are these the things that are happening now? Because the 7 bowls of God's fury are being poured out. The physical return of Jesus is first mentioned here in chapter 16 like this: "Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who watches and keeps his clothes ready, so that he may not go naked and people see him exposed." In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 24, Jesus said he would come without warning, like a thief, starting at verse 42. "Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on which day your Lord will come. Be sure of this, if the master of the house had known the hour of night when the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and not let his house be broken into. So too, you also must be prepared, for at an hour you do not expect, the Son of Man will come." So we have what Jesus said in Matthew 24 matches what John wrote in Revelation 16. Now, what points to the specific location where the final battle begins? Revelation chapter 16, verse 16 tells us, "They then assembled the kings in the place that is named Armageddon in Hebrew." The kings are the opposing armies against Israel. Armageddon in Hebrew means mountain of Megiddo. Megiddo was the location of many battles in the Old Testament and is identified here as the starting location of where the battle begins. So here's Megiddo, just south of Nazareth. We saw chapter 14, verses 18 through 20, bringing the Jewish people into the battle. Here, chapter 16, verse 16 tells us where the battle begins, and it goes for 200 miles, with the battle starting at Armageddon. So this is how Bible scholars have come to the conclusion that Israel will be the target of a massive battle that will be the result of their being attacked by multiple countries that surround Israel. Chapter 25 of Matthew's Gospel will be divided up into 3 parts and will be the Gospel readings for the next 3 weeks, which will conclude the religious year. Matthew chapters 23, 24, and 25 all take place on the Mount of Olives, where Jesus is teaching his disciples until he prepares for his final Passover feast with them. When we study the final gospel reading of the religious year on November 22nd, we will conclude how the end of the book of Revelation relates to the gospel readings for that Sunday, prophesying how Jesus will return to the earth and how the new heaven and new earth will come into existence.